then we're sunk. And that's the danger. So there has to be a system of tech support through the Department of Agriculture, through your programs, tech support for these programs. There have to be standards, and there has to be testing. There has to be somebody who, if I were running a water system, I would hire an outside group to try to hack me, to show whether or not I'm vulnerable. Most CIOs say, yeah, boss, we're okay. I don't think we are. And the only way to determine that is by what's called penetration testing, which is actually hackers for hire, friendly hackers, to determine where your vulnerability lies. We need to talk about systemically important critical infrastructure and setting up an environment. In our report, we call it a joint collaborative environment where the private sector and the government can share information in real time with confidence and trust that will enable us to bring to bear the resources of the federal government, and also to allow the private sector to have some liability protection if they're going to share information, and have this relationship, because a week later doesn't work. So to go back to the beginning, there is an incipient nightmare here, and it involves all sectors of our critical infrastructure, but water, I think, is probably the most vulnerable because of the dispersed nature of water systems in the country. So I commend this committee for attending to this issue. Look forward to working with you as we try to work through the solutions and to have our game at the level of our adversaries. This is a potential nightmare, but it's one that we can wake up from if indeed we wake up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We should pay you for coming and testifying. Well, that was terrific. That was just terrific. Actually, we do pay you for coming and testifying. I would say to Congressman Gallagher, Senator Capito, and I love working with this, your colleague here, on a lot of issues. And whenever I have the opportunity to co-sponsor a bill with Angus, I always insist that his name goes first. And that people can describe the legislation as King Carper. So, you think I'm kidding?
I've always talked about it with Tom Cotton, King Cotton, as a kind of...
All right, gentlemen, I know you don't have anything else to do today. So.
Congress, however, took no action, prompting the Commission to pass an amendment to the sentencing guidelines in 2007 as a partial and modest remedy to the urgent and compelling problems associated with the ratio. In doing so, the Commission unanimously and strongly urged Congress to take action on its recommendations and to provide a comprehensive solution. In 2010, Congress finally acted by passing the Fair Sentencing Act, which did not eliminate the disparity, which significantly reduced the disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. But the fair sentencing applied only to pending and future cases, leaving thousands of inmates without a path of petition for relief. The First Step Act of 2018 made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, providing a path of relief for some, but not all, individuals affected by the sentencing disparity. It is now past time to finish the job. The crack cocaine and powder cocaine disparity has greatly contributed to the rise of mass incarceration, devastated communities of color, and severely undermined public confidence in our criminal justice system. The Equal Act would finally equalize the treatment of powder cocaine and crack cocaine, two forms of the same drug, by eliminating the sentencing disparity. It would also provide a path to retroactive relief from a disparity that is not rooted in science, does not promote public safety, and fosters racial disparities. This bipartisan legislation represents an important step in our efforts to reform the criminal justice system. I commend Representative Jeffries for introducing this important legislation and for assembling a broad and bipartisan coalition of stakeholders in support of the bill, including the Department of Justice and advocacy groups that span the ideological spectrum. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, the Federal Criminal Code has contained harsher punishments for individuals convicted of or sentenced for federal crimes related to crack cocaine as compared to powder cocaine, as you said in your opening statement. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between these two substances. At a hearing on this issue just a few weeks ago, many on the other side of the aisle discussed the racial disparity that these mandatory minimum sentences have on communities of color. But we should remember how this disparity came into existence. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 passed the Democrat-controlled House by a vote of 392 to 16. Among the Democrats voting for the act in 86 were then Representative Chuck Schumer, Dick Durbin, Charlie Rangel, Major Owens. In the Senate, the act passed 97 to 2, with then Senators Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Al Gore all voting in favor. In fact, then Senator Biden not only voted for the measure, he co-sponsored it and helped write it. In 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1, so a step in the right direction. In 2018, Congress passed and President Trump signed the First Step Act, which made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. This law allowed anyone sentenced for federal drug offenses related to cocaine to move for a resentencing under the 2010 standard. The Equal Act would eliminate the federal sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine and allow someone previously convicted of an offense related to cocaine to move for resentencing. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and yield back and look forward to our discussion.
I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I am proud to support H.R. 1693, which will finally eliminate the sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine offenses and provide retroactive relief to the thousands of individuals who received harsh and unfair sentencing based on this disparities. If you were to take a journey through the prison systems of America, both state and federal, you would see the remnants of the failed war on drugs. Individuals who received 20 and 30 and 40-year sentences, mostly falling and burdening those in urban centers and, yes, rural centers. I've long championed the equalization of crack cocaine and powder cocaine offenses. Beginning in 2007, I introduced legislation, H.R. 295, that would have ended the disparity because we had learned the most of the assumptions on which the 100-to-1 ratio was based turned out to be unfounded. For example, science makes clear that powder cocaine and crack cocaine are two forms of the same drug, producing similar effects once they reach the brain. There is no scientific basis for treating crack cocaine more harshly than powder cocaine. We also learned that there is no greater danger to public safety from crack offenders than powder cocaine offenders, and that the 100-to-1 ratio overstated the relative harmfulness of the two forms of cocaine and diverted federal resources away from prosecuting the highest level traffickers. The unfounded assumption that led to the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity has damaged communities of color for generations. A higher percentage of Black Americans are convicted of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine offenses and receive significantly longer sentences for comparable offenses. I'm aware of a neighbor's brother who was standing on a street corner, had crack cocaine, and was not only charged with that offense, but was charged with conspiracy and was sentenced to 25 years in his young life. The percentage of individuals serving unreasonably longer sentences because of the disparity are not mere statistics from the Sentencing Commission. This data reflects lost years for thousands of individuals and families. These individuals are fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They are William Underwood, Matthew Charles, and Cynthia Shank, who testified before the House and Senate Judiciary Committees about the devastating impact that the sentencing disparity and mandatory minimum laws have had on them, their families, and countless others who are similarly situated. The crack and powder cocaine sentencing disparity is another byproduct of our country's failed war on drugs and our punitive response to the crack cocaine crisis of the 1980s. Congress, along race-based myths and unfounded assumptions about crack cocaine to shape federal cocaine sentencing policy. Rather, they allowed race-based myths. But it is time for science, data, and evidence to reform it. Congress stated that process started that process in 2010 when it passed the Fair Sentencing Act and reduced the sentencing disparity to 18-1. The First Step Act of 2018 made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. But the crack and powder cocaine disparity persists even under the 18-1 ratio. In fiscal year 2019, nearly 81% of crack cocaine offenders were Black, while 27.4% of powder cocaine offenders were Black. In fiscal year 2020, 77.1% of crack cocaine offenders were Black, while 27.3% of powder cocaine offenders were Black. Since 2010, the gap between the average sentence imposed for crack and powder cocaine offenses have narrowed but not closed. And as the Supreme Court recently noted in Terry versus United States, the lowest level of crack cocaine offenders are still ineligible for relief despite Congress' passage of the First Step Act. Today, we can end this injustice by passing the Equal Act of 2021 and putting an end to the harmful impact of the crack and powder cocaine sentencing disparity. In doing so, we will also ensure that thousands of people who have lost years of their lives because of the failed policies of the war on drugs have the opportunity for resentencing. I thank our friend, Representative and Chairman Jeffries, for introducing this bipartisan and bicameral legislation with original co-sponsors of Representative Bobby Scott, Kelly Armstrong, and Don Bacon, and delighted for those of us on Judiciary, as well as myself, to be co-sponsors on this important legislation. I also thank Chairman Nadler for his leadership in bringing up this bill as part of our federal sentencing reform agenda that we will continue to press in the subcommittee of which I chair. I urge my colleagues to join the bipartisan support, and that means all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, for the Equal Act, which includes members of this committee, and to vote yes on H.R. 1693. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman. It's so important to remember the words of one of our witnesses from a hearing on this topic just a few weeks ago. At a hearing on this issue, many on the other side of the dais discussed the racial disparity that these mandatory minimum sentences have on communities of color. Mr. Malcolm noted how he'd, quote, been struck at how often people agree about what ought to be done, even if they disagree about why those measures are warranted, close quote. He urged us to, quote, focus on your areas of agreement and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, close quote. I hope that's what happens here today. Whether you support the bill or oppose it, I hope we can have an honest debate, honest discussion. I was struck at that hearing just a couple of weeks ago that many members on the other side claimed that the crack powder disparity is rooted in racist ideology. The reason that was so striking to me is because President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, and Majority Leader Schumer, all here when that law was put into place, supported the underlying laws that the Equal Act would now amend. Are we to believe that Democrats put racists in 3 of the top 4 political positions in this country, as would be implied by the previous speaker's comments? Around the time these laws were being passed, Ebony magazine profiled Congressman Charlie Rangel. The magazine labeled Congressman Rangel as, quote, the frontline general in the war on drugs, close quote. Representative Rangel is quoted as saying, I don't know what's behind the lackadaisical attitudes towards drugs, but I do know that the American people have made it abundantly clear. They are outraged by the indifference of the U.S. government to this problem. A couple years after that article, Congressman Rangel stated, quote, we should not allow people to be able to distribute this poison without the fear that maybe they might be arrested and put in jail, close quote. Nobody in this room believes Charlie Rangel was or is a racist. So as we go through this today, I hope that we have a meaningful substantive discussion rather than a discussion that imputes motivations that may be wildly inaccurate. I hope that cooler heads prevail. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1693, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Strike all that follows after the enacting clause.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will now recognize myself to explain the amendment. This amendment adds the phrase of 2021 to the bill's short title, but it makes no substantive changes to the bill. I urge members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
I move to strike the last word.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, the sponsor of the bill, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank the distinguished chairman for your leadership and for recognizing me today. We are here to mark up H.R. 1693, the Eliminating a Quantifiably Unjust Application of the Law Act, otherwise referred to as the Equal Act, which will finally eliminate the federal crack and powder cocaine sentencing disparity and provide retroactive relief to those who have already been convicted or sentenced. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established a 100-to-1 disparity in sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That means a 5-year mandatory prison sentence for distribution of 500 grams of powder cocaine, but only 5 grams of crack cocaine to trigger the same sentence. Of course, there's no policy justification for punishing crack cocaine offenses more harshly than the same offense involving powder cocaine. Indeed, there is no pharmacological difference, no chemical difference, no physical difference in how the body processes crack cocaine as compared to powder cocaine. But there was a difference in terms of its disparate impact on communities of color and low-income communities of every single race. In urban America, in rural America, small-town America, and in Appalachia. Now, according to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, in fiscal year 2020, 77.1% of crack cocaine trafficking offenses were Black, whereas most powder cocaine offenders ultimately convicted and prosecuted were either white or Hispanic. There's a significant economic cost as well to the sentencing disparity. A recent report from the Prison Policy Initiative found that our system of mass incarceration, fueled in part by unjust sentencing drug laws, cost the government and American families and the taxpayers at least $182 billion every year. Of course, the human and economic costs of these policies have not resulted in improved public safety, which was the rationale used to justify the original laws. That is why we have the support of right of censor groups like the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, as well as notably the National District Attorneys Association. Stakeholders who, of course, understand what's necessary to keep America safe and have dedicated their life to doing so. They recognize that this law has been unsuccessful, unjust, and uneconomical. Now, Congress has acted several times, led by the Judiciary Committee, to incrementally eliminate and address the sentencing disparity. In 2010, Congress passed the Bipartisan Fair Sentencing Act, led by former members Bobby Scott and Jim Sensenbrenner, which reduced the disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. And then, of course, the Bipartisan First Step Act of 2018, which former President Trump signed into law, made that change from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1 retroactive. Today, 35 years after the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was signed into law and 50 years after President Richard Nixon declared the beginning of the failed war on drugs, it's time for this Judiciary Committee to finish the job that we have started over a decade ago and end this discriminatory law once and for all. The bill has broad support from groups within the law enforcement community, civil rights community, faith community, medical community, progressives, conservatives, and all points in between, and I would like to thank them for their tireless advocacy. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters from these organizations and their statements of support.
Without objection.
I also want to thank the bipartisan co-sponsors of this legislation, Representatives Kelly Armstrong, Bobby Scott, and Don Bacon, for their partner in leadership. I want to thank the chair of the subcommittee, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, for her steadfast leadership in this area, as well as the Republican supporters of this legislation in the Senate, Senators Portman, Tillis, and Rand Paul, along with Senators Booker and Durbin on our side of the aisle. I appreciate your time and consideration and urge the committee to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm grateful to Congressman Jeffries for bringing this bill. And just so there's clarity about why there is such a gross disparity, since I've been here in Congress, the issue came up of the great disparity, and there were comments made at the time that, this was a racist disparity. Dan Lundgren was here, and he was saying that he was here back in the 80s when that had passed, and that Republicans had been told, some of the white members, if you don't support, and Charlie Rangel was pushing, most of the Congressional Black Caucus was, but he said Rangel's pitch was, if you do not support this big disparity in punishing crack cocaine, then you must be against minority communities because crack cocaine is absolutely destroying black communities. And that, the Republicans didn't want to be seen as racist, so they voted for that big disparity. And I agree with my colleagues across the aisle now that there really was not appropriate to have that kind of disparity. As someone who has sentenced people for both powder and crack cocaine under state law, I don't see any reason there should be this kind of disparity. But I would also caution that we be careful about how the term racist is used, because that term enabled a bill to pass that actually was racist, not in the intention of anybody, including the Black Caucus that was pushing it, but in effect, it was very unfair in the way it ended up treating people who had crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine. So I'd made the comment previously that it would be great if we could have a bill that just fixed this gross disparity, even the 18-to-1, and I am grateful to Mr. Jeffries for doing exactly that. This was a very clean bill that did exactly what the gentleman had indicated it would, and that's why I am pleased to be a co-sponsor and very grateful that you've handled it this way.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Well, the gentleman is exactly right. Charlie Rangel and other members of the Black Caucus did back in the 1980s say that this was racist. They were wrong then, and they have admitted since then that
Yes.
they were wrong. I don't think there's any single member of the Black Caucus, current or present, who doesn't think, who hasn't admitted, if they were then here, that their mistake.
And reclaim my time. So I applaud this. This is the way we ought to be doing things. I like having one subject, one bill, and we agree this does need to be fixed. So thank the chairman for bringing this to committee for a markup, and I'm very grateful for the way in which this was brought to the committee.
Will the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
I want to thank the distinguished gentleman from Texas. We had this conversation informally, you and Cedric Richmond, when he was a part of the committee, and we appreciate your support and your commitment to dealing with this issue. And I think the record is very clear. It was a bipartisan failure. And as Chairman...
But you did it, and you made it happen. And I'm grateful for that.
Well,
and the record should reflect you did exactly what you said you were going to do, and I'm very grateful for that.
thank you.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill to the committee, and I want to thank my friend, Chairman Jeffries, for introducing this vital and overdue bipartisan and bicameral legislation. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law unjustly drew a drastic distinction between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, the same drug, just in a different form. That distinction created a sentencing disparity of up to 100 to 1, meaning you needed 100 times the amount of powder cocaine than crack cocaine to get the same sentence. We cannot overlook that this difference, like many drug enforcement laws in our history, created a highly disproportionate impact on communities of color. And there was no evidence-based rationale for this disparity. After decades of advocates and experts fighting to change the sentencing disparity, Congress finally acted in 2010 with the Fair Sentencing Act, which changed the disparity from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. The First Step Act of 2018 made that change retroactive. We finally took a step in the right direction, but that wasn't enough. Just because 18 is lower than 100 doesn't mean we made things fair. There is still a huge sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine-related offenses today. This vital legislation finally ends the discriminatory sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. It also importantly allows for those currently serving sentences related to crack cocaine to petition to have their sentences appropriately reduced. Our prisons are overcrowded and lives are hurt every day because of sentencing disparities and high sentencing minimums for nonviolent crimes in America. This is one step of the many we need to take to change this horrible cycle. I want to thank Chairman Jeffries for this important legislation. I'm proud to support it today, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think today is an extremely important day for all of us who want to take away a talking point which is real, which is appropriately need to be reduced. Like you, I was here when we reduced from the 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, recognizing an extremely addictive drug and one that still has an adverse effect on our community. But in fairness, if the debate continued to be about the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, then we're missing the point. The point is that the war on drugs is not over, and to the extent that some want to call it a failed war for purposes of reducing or eliminating the punishment and the real effort to stop the illicit use of these dangerous drugs, they miss the point. Moving it to a 1-to-1 ratio, I believe, is not decriminalizing, nor would I support it if it is. Crack cocaine, powder cocaine, the various opiates of all sorts, including the synthetics like fentanyl, continue to represent a threat to our society and, in fact, are to a great extent the cause of violence. Legalizing these drugs or decriminalizing them would not in any way, shape, or form make our streets safer, our communities more productive, or life better for the very people we speak about today. For that reason, the reason of wanting to make sure that people have a confidence that it is not about one group over the other, it is not about punishing one group based on their race or the location that they're likely to live in, but rather a recognition that these drugs are dangerous, these drugs need to be stopped, and people will be punished, but that punishment will be equal to the suburban, well-to-do powder user versus the urban crack user is a worthwhile effort. So just as we did a decade ago, it is time to send that message, the message that Congress takes the illicit use of these drugs seriously, but wants to make sure that people believe that the protection of the communities versus the punishment of those who break the law is equal under the law, I support this legislation. But again, I do not support this legislation because it decriminalizes or because it's going to make the sentences light. I support it because it's going to allow people to get off the subject of somehow the disparity and on the subject of the danger of cocaine, just as the danger of fentanyl and other drugs are real and continue to have a detrimental effect on our society. So I hope that as we quickly pass this legislation, move it to the President's desk, we will do so recognizing two things. One, that we are still engaged in what will be a struggle for all of our lives, which is to keep our children from being hooked on addictive drugs that diminish their ability to be productive. And two, that we are not here to say that people are racist because of what the law was. As some of the other speakers have said, many of the people who did this did so at a time of great strife in their communities. I served with Charlie Rangel, as many of us on the dais did. I know that, in fact, he was dealing with a community that was ravaged by crack cocaine, and that he was doing what he thought at the time was the best. If he were here today, I have no doubt he would be leading the charge for this very change, but not because he cares differently about his community, but because the time for the message has changed, but not the time to continue the struggle against illicit drugs that diminish the lives of people in our communities, whether the suburban, the rural, or the urban. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this legislation in a timely fashion and yield back. Of course I'd yield.
Let me just quickly with your assessment of Mr. Rangel's advocacy. All of us knew him, and the chairman is right, but I do think it is important to take note that facts change, crises do not, but facts change, and I believe Mr. Rangel, a former U.S. Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney, was trying to save lives, as well as the Congressional Black Caucus. We maintain that we are the conscience of the Congress as it relates to these issues, and I can truly say that is where his direction was. This is now done by the gentleman from New York. I think it's more than appropriate, but I think we should recognize the times of that particular moment as related to crack cocaine. We're now looking to equalize the issues and to treat drug addiction in a totally different way. I just conclude my remarks by saying we remember the war on drugs led by other persons, and we see that that did not work. And so here we're trying to do what is right in 2021. I thank you for allowing me to have the time. I yield
Thank
back.
the gentlelady and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
The disparate sentencing between crack and powder cocaine is a harmful remnant of the war on drugs, and it's contributed to the mass incarceration we see across the country. I'm thankful that national leadership and this Congress have chosen to learn from history and correct the mistakes of the past. In this case, the discriminatory sentencing disparities in crack cocaine offenses, which turbocharged the rise in mass incarceration. We've made progress on this issue with the Fair Sentencing Act and the First Step Act in recent years, but today we can go further. 6 years ago, I had the privilege to participate in the Clemency 2014 project, a joint initiative of the White House, the Department of Justice, and a host of nonprofit organizations across the ideological spectrum, ranging from the Koch brothers to Families Against Mandatory Minimums. With that project, I joined private bar lawyers across the country in screening thousands of case files of nonviolent offenders who'd been subjected to these unfair mandatory minimums. We filed hundreds of clemency petitions, and I was so pleased to be part of an effort with my firm where we obtained clemency for 29 individuals. In representing those clients, the devastation of the drug epidemic became clear, as did the fact that that devastation was compounded by harsh sentences for nonviolent, low-level offenders. by representing these folks, by talking with them and their families. We saw it, how it had destroyed their lives, destroyed their families, destroyed their communities. So now is the time to fully fix, actually it's past time, to fully fix this unjustified disparity once and for all, especially for those still serving sentences based upon it. Importantly, this bill is retroactive and allows those harmed by this misguided policy to seek justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Jeffries, for putting forth this critical legislation for our consideration today. I'm looking forward to voting to pass the Equal Act out of committee today and urge all of my colleagues to support the bill. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Deming seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a former police chief, I joined the Major City Chiefs Association in their support of this bipartisan legislation, the Equal Act. While we as a nation have come a long way, I clearly understand that there is still much work to do, and I am honored that we are doing that work together on this day. I served 27 years as an enforcer of the law, and now I have the privilege of serving here with my colleagues in Congress, writing the laws. Accountability does matter, but regardless of our political affiliation, as legislators, we share the awesome responsibility to eliminate, modify, tweak any policy or practice that has a disparate impact on any group of people. I know as a former law enforcement officer and a social worker that drug addiction has devastated many communities and many families. And I look forward to, in the future, working together to invest more resources in the treatment of individuals suffering from this devastating disease. But we must address sentencing disparities. Many colleagues here today have already pointed out an individual convicted of an offense involving 5 grams of crack cocaine would face the same mandatory minimum sentence as an individual convicted of a crime involving 500 grams of powdered cocaine. We know that that is not right. I clearly hear the concerns of my brothers and sisters of the National Association of Police Organizations about violent crime. As a police chief, the reduction of violent crime was my *1 priority. But the disparities involving the mere possession of crack versus powdered cocaine must be addressed. 41 states have already eliminated the sentencing disparities at the state level. Protecting Americans continues to be my top priority. The rule of law and the proper application of the law clearly define who we are as a nation. We can and we must rise up to meet this moment. I urge my colleagues to let's unanimously support this legislation. I thank the gentleman from New York, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
For what purpose, the gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only purpose is to submit for the record a letter dated July 16, 2021 from National Association of Police Organizations, Inc.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Cohen seek recognition?
Strike the last word and maybe the last 20 years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I walked in today, I thought of Bill Murray, and I thought of it even more when I got here. For the first person I saw on entering Rayburn was Bob Goodlatte, the honorable, decent, good human being, Bob Goodlatte. And it was like Groundhog's Day, seeing Bob walk into the building. And then to come to committee where he used to chair and hear us discussing crack cocaine and who was racist and what is racist and the war on drugs is even more Groundhog's Day. This war on drugs is as much, and I would submit a greater failure than which I think is the right thing to do, but is still going to be a detriment to the girls and the women of Afghanistan and probably to many of the people who helped us, because we're not going to be able to get them out, wait until the last minute to try to get them out. The people that helped us as interpreters, translators, aides, etc. We can get out of the war on drugs too. But it'll take a bipartisan effort. It'll take the president to work with us. And it doesn't mean legalizing everything, but it means seeing these things as social problems, as mental health and physical health issues. Sending somebody who's hooked on heroin or cocaine or some other drug of that nature to jail is a waste of time and an error. To get them help and treatment is the right thing to do. This bill is long overdue. I remember when Bobby Scott and we worked to get it to 18-1. Well, 18-1 was not as bad as 100, but it was still wrong. And that was 10 years ago, I think. What Congressman Jeffries is doing, and those of us who co-sponsored are doing the right thing. But unfortunately, Congress is slow as molasses in getting things done right and getting up to date and getting over cultural lag. This is a cultural lag oasis. And this bill ends one of those cultural lags. But another is having marijuana scheduled as Schedule 1. We've been talking about that the entire 15 years I've been here and before. And that's just as insane and just as much of a cultural lag. Marijuana is not as dangerous as heroin and the other drugs of which it's associated. And we need to deschedule it and get it out of the federal jurisdiction. You know, there was just a sprinter, Miss Shari Richardson, who was America's top 100-meter contestant to be in the Olympics. Her mother died. She smoked some marijuana after her mother's death because she was depressed and aggrieved, and she was in Oregon, a state where it's legal. But she had it in her system because it stays in your system for give or take 20 days. And so the Olympic Committee said, no, she can't compete. A lifelong dream that she'd been working for years and years and years, and she's not allowed to go to Tokyo. Marijuana is not a performance-enhancing drug unless you're entered in the Coney Island hot dog eating contest on the 4th of July. To take her right to appear and her dream away from her is absurd, and this Congress should see that we don't have these problems in the future. We deschedule marijuana. We leave it up to the states. If she'd have got rip-roaring drunk on margaritas, Red Bull, or whatever else you drink out there these days, lagers, she'd have been fine because it wouldn't have shown up in her system. If it had shown in her system, if she'd have been 0.20 alcohol, she still would have been allowed to run. But for marijuana that could have been 20 days ago and just a puff or two, she's gone. So let's get real. The war on drugs is a total failure. Nancy Reagan was wrong. Everybody who followed her and the others who said just say no were wrong because that wasn't sufficient. Let's pass this bill and let's decriminalize marijuana and let's get our people to where they are not being afflicted by the cultural lag of the United States Congress. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlemen, yield back. For what purposes the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1693, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. Page 2, strike lines 10 through 18.
Amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
I thank the chairman. I move to strike the last word. This amendment, which focuses on H.R. 1693's retroactivity provision, makes technical but important changes to ensure that our courts have the ability and discretion to efficiently decide sentence reduction motions that are filed by or on behalf of individuals who have been sentenced to crack cocaine offenses. After we passed the Fair Sentencing Act and First Step Act, federal courts were immediately bogged down in litigation involving a range of technical and substantive issues about the legislation. This litigation led to circuit splits and considerable delay for individuals seeking relief. The amendment first clarifies that the Equal Act's retroactivity provision applies to individuals that, in fact, who were sentenced to specific federal offenses involving crack cocaine on or before the date of enactment. Second, it allows courts to decide and hold resentencing hearings without the requirement that the defendant be present. Rule 43 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure requires a defendant's presence at sentencing hearings, but resentencing presents issues that are not generally implicated during the initial sentencing process. Specifically, defendants who are already serving sentences are often incarcerated at federal facilities in states that are far from the district in which they were sentenced. This means the U.S. Marshals would have to transport individuals for hearings in which relief may or may not be granted by the court. Depending on the location, this transport could take weeks, denying that particular incarcerated person their rights. By adding language that does not require the defendant's presence, we will eliminate the burden on the marshals and unnecessary litigation over a technical issue. This also allows individuals seeking resentencing to receive a timelier adjudication of their motions. We've already made a commitment as we support the Equal Act that we've lived in an unfair system. As we proceed to retroactively deal with resentencing, let's make it so these incarcerated persons can get their just day, hopefully their fair day. Third, the amendment adds the First Step Act's language limiting the number of motions that can be made under the Equal Act. This promotes judicial economy without diminishing the ability for all affected by the crack cocaine disparity to be heard and resentenced by courts in a timely manner. Again, justice must prevail. Finally, the amendment makes clear that courts have the discretion to grant motions for a sentence reduction based on the factors raised in 18 U.S.C. Section 3553A. Sentencing courts are in the best position to decide sentences based on all of the factors before it. We must ensure that we maintain a court's judicial discretion and the mandate on courts to impose sentences that are sufficient, but are fair, just, and not greater than necessary under the current law. I believe that this represents the sentiment of most of the members of this committee over the years. With that, I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose is the gentleman seek recognition?
Well, just strike the last word. I would just say I think the amendment makes sense and is a good amendment. And I think our side will support that and appreciate the gentlelady bringing it forward.
Thank you, Mr.
The
Rankin.
gentleman yields back, and I now recognize myself to speak in support of the Jackson Lee amendment. The amendment makes several important changes to the Equal Act that strengthen the underlying legislation. It clarifies the application of the Act's retroactivity provisions specifically for crack cocaine offenses. It also promotes judicial economy by not requiring defendants to be present at resentencing, by incorporating the First Step Act's limitation on successive motions, and by making clear that courts have discretion in deciding motions for resentencing relief. In making these changes, we will ensure that individuals affected by the unjust sentencing disparity have a clear pathway for relief, and that our judicial system is not overburdened as courts fully exercise their discretion to consider motions for thousands of individuals who have been waiting year after year for the relief provided by the Equal Act. I thank Chairwoman Lee for offering the amendment. I thank Mr. Jordan for supporting it, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. I yield back. For what purpose does Mr. Raskin seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in very strong favor of Mr. Jeffries' legislation, and I just want to salute him on the Equal Act, which eliminates that 18-to-1 sentencing disparity between powder cocaine and crack cocaine offenses, which itself, of course, was an improvement over the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity embodied in the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And it's especially gratifying to see, such broad bipartisan support across the aisle for doing this. And I just wanted to take a moment to observe that we are all recognizing that this is an unjust disparity built into the law that has clear racially disproportionate effects, but it was not undertaken with any deliberate racist motive. All of which is to say that the law can operate in a way that adversely affects racial minority groups, even if the law is not adopted with a specific invidious purpose of discriminating against them. So it's a good teaching and learning moment for all of us, and I'm glad that we're moving forward to make the law much more equal and much more fair, regardless of where you stand on the underlying question of the war on drugs. And I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Dean seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I too rise in support of the underlying legislation as well as the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas. This is a remarkable day. It's terrific to hear legislators recognizing the disparate impact, the unfair, unjust impact of former legislation. It's always the right time to correct what was a mistake of the past. This morning, I lend my unwavering support to the Equal Act. I recognize the importance of speaking truth to power when we discuss both addiction and racist sentencing disparities that have cast a shadow on the United States since the beginning of the so-called war on drugs. During multiple hearings, I've spoken to the failure that the war on drugs in the United States has imposed and commend the committee, Chairman Nadler, you for bringing up this important bill to markup. I echo the leadership of Representative Jeffries in highlighting the unjust sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, a disparity not supported by criminal justice, not supported by science, and only supported by racial disparities that continue to be present within our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system currently is not a one-size-fits-all system. For far too long, the United States has relied on a system of over-criminalization in which we overuse and misuse criminal law to address societal harms that could be more effectively handled through civil channels or other institutions. We have to deal with the issue of addiction and not simply criminalize it. This is evidenced by the nation's present incarcerated population, which sadly boasts of approximately 2.3 million people. This bill is an important first step to address the unjust war on drugs through its important retroactivity provisions made stronger by this amendment. I look forward to a future where drug addiction is addressed in a manner supported by science and health, decriminalization, and compassion for those who suffer from this disease. I urge my colleagues in this House to lend your support to the overdue bill, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose? Oh, the question occurs on the Jackson-Lee amendment to the amendment nature of a substitute. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes obviously have it. Are there any further amendments to the amendment nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chair.
Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The point of order is reserved. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1693, offered by Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. Add at the end the following: the fentanyl or fentanyl analog cases. Nothing in this section.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good bill before us today, and good amendment that we just adopted. Has everything kind of moving in the right direction. I think I have something that I would hope that members of the committee would consider. I just returned from McAllen, Texas last week with Representative Biggs, and we had an opportunity not only to meet with Border Patrol and observe a lot of things that, quite honestly, were surprising to me or shocking to me, having not been to the border before in that context. But the one thing we heard from Homeland Security is kind of the methods they used or the approach they used to continue to catch most of the narcotics that they could, in fact, by design, come up with a strategy to capture, that are making their way across the border right now at an alarming rate. And there were some percentages thrown out where only 20% of maybe what's coming across is actually being apprehended. The major discussion was, again, and it's interesting to hear some of the comments, but a lot of it that was being captured was marijuana, cocaine, and fentanyl. Fentanyl. And, so I know there was some discussion here about the war on drugs, but unfortunately, America's not fighting the war on drugs in a vacuum. There are so many other global influences on what's happening here. We know that the components of fentanyl are being manufactured in China, making their way to many different parts of South America. And then the fentanyl comes across. And there was a couple of anecdotal stories, but the one I just wanted to relay was there was a bachelor party where 4 guys were smoking pot. And unfortunately, that pot was laced with fentanyl. And one of the individuals died, and 3 of them ended up in the hospital. So, what's being dismissed, I think, as, don't worry about it, it's just a few people smoking pot. That is not necessarily the case. The Mexican cartels, they continue to have full control over the production and supply of fentanyl into the U.S. And if you talk to law enforcement, they're going to tell you, this stuff is so deadly and so available. It's the new front that we need to fight on a regular basis. So the amendment I have before the committee today would simply, once again, incorporate the idea that fentanyl should be a Schedule I drug, and we're working on that with the SOFA Act, and we need to close any of these loopholes that I think currently exist. And like I said, good bill before us today, great bill, is going to tackle something that's very complex. And I think that Representative Jackson's amendment makes it better. And I think this also would not only, I think, do that. And if we were going to have a bill later on that was going to deal with the fentanyl issue, great, okay, let's do that. But, it's here. We're here this morning. We're tackling something that's bipartisan. We all know that this is a major issue. And I think that this amendment would make this bill much better. And who would oppose it once we get out of this committee? I mean, I can't believe that there would be anybody that would dismiss this as not necessary. If you talk to your local law enforcement, they're going to tell you it's here. It's not something that's coming. It's here on our doorstep. Let's do something about it right here this morning. Let's close this down. Let's give law enforcement the tools they need to fight this deadly drug that's now here in America. And I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentlelady insist on a point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn. The gentlelady withdraws a point of order. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The amendment is clearly well-intended, but it is not necessary, and I am concerned that that the amendment may be read incorrectly, but it may be read as limiting the application of the bill in a way that we wouldn't want it limited. So I would oppose it, although I really don't think and I don't think it's necessary. But it might be misread. So on those grounds, I would oppose it. I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Yeah, no, I appreciate the spirit in which the distinguished gentleman has offered this amendment, and certainly look forward to working with him on some of these issues and challenges related to fentanyl. I think as the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, indicated, our objective here was to deal with this issue of the sentencing disparity involving crack cocaine and powder cocaine in the cleanest possible way. And it's for that reason that I oppose the amendment, but appreciate the spirit in which it has been offered.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman yield back? Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Jordan seek recognition?
Well, I strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. This is as simple as it gets. I mean, as the gentleman from Wisconsin it's a one-sentence amendment that says, we all know fentanyl is bad. Let's make sure we keep it that way and deal with it in the appropriate fashion. It's straightforward. If the chairman thinks I don't see where the chairman could think it's not necessary to state what we all know is obvious in a plain and straightforward amendment dealing with a substance that is wreaking havoc in so many of our communities in every one of our districts. So why not err on the side of making sure we deal with something in the best way possible, particularly a drug of this, a dangerous drug like this that has done so much harm to so many communities. With that, unless the gentleman from Wisconsin would like some time.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin, then I'll yield to the gentleman from Tennessee if there's time left.
Thank you to the ranking member. I mean, we know that, you know, maybe we were in a territory where there was a question of germaneness. That's why we drafted an amendment to the amendment to kind of clear that up. I think we're really in good shape right now, and I can't understand why we wouldn't just simply take care of this right now. It makes no sense to me. I mean, I understand, you know, people get kind of protective of their own piece of legislation and they don't want it amended and they don't want it maybe off the target. But I mean, this is all I heard about at the border was fentanyl and the deadliness of it and the effect it's having on this country. And like I said earlier, if there was a bill coming down the pike that dealt with just that issue, great. Let's take that up. But I'm unaware of that. And here it is before us this morning. Again, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure why we wouldn't tackle this right now. And I yield back to the ranking member.
Yield to the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. And the question really is directed to anybody who can answer it. I don't see how this relates to the bill we've got before us. It changes crack and cocaine. It deals with crack and cocaine. I'm all against fentanyl, but this bill doesn't relate to fentanyl, and it doesn't change anything to do with fentanyl. It doesn't make the sentences less. As I see it, it doesn't change them. It has nothing to do with fentanyl. So if somebody can tell me why this fits, and if we do it, what difference it'll make in the world. I mean, I'm all against fentanyl. I'll be for all the anti-fentanyl, anti-heroin, anti-buggery, anti-whatever bills you want to bring. But what has it got to do with this bill?
Well, I think the chairman already answered that question, said it was germane, and it deals with a very important issue that is confronting our country, confronting our nation, confronting every single neighborhood. And that's why the gentleman from Wisconsin brought his amendment forward. Be happy to yield to the gentleman from Ohio.
I thank gentlemen for yielding. I won't take a lot of time, but I thank the gentleman for offering this very constructive amendment, I believe. And this has been a pretty bipartisan markup here, and I think we're, for the most part, on the same side on this. We're trying to do what's fair here, and I think what's fair would be to include the gentleman's amendment in this. Fentanyl is killing thousands and thousands of Americans all across the country in all of our districts. I know it is in my district, and the thing that's so deadly about it is oftentimes people that, let's face it, shouldn't be ingesting or smoking or however they're taking the drugs to begin with, but some do. And many aren't aware that it's been laced with fentanyl, and there are analogs, and so the bad guys have been able to get around the traditional fentanyl by just modifying it in a slight manner molecularly, which makes it tough for the laws to actually apply in every case, makes it tough for prosecutors, and we've worked on that issue in a bipartisan manner for some time. But it's killing thousands and thousands of Americans, and I guess it would be more convenient just to ignore it altogether in this hearing. Why? Well, maybe because, for example, it's coming in from our greatest rival, China, and competitor, some would say enemy. but it's coming from there, and much of it is coming across a border which was pretty secure for quite some time because of the work of the previous administration and the Congress to some extent, which now is a tremendous crisis down, the Biden crisis at our southern border. It's coming across there and killing Americans, but I think if I had that record, I wouldn't want to talk about this either. So thank you to the gentleman for offering it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to strike the last word. Let me associate myself with Mr. Chavitz's remarks that this legislation and this discussion has been enormously bipartisan, and I take the words of the ranking member seriously. I withdrew my objection. I think the gentleman from New York, the proponent of this legislation, has a very pointed remark. What I would say to you is that I think if we did a poll, I am assured that everyone would be opposed to fentanyl. It kills. So the chairman, ranking member, and to the proponent of the amendment, let's let our committee, our subcommittee is very interested in this issue. And I would make the argument that we could work together on the question of fentanyl in a more extensive way that would not, if you will, steer us away from the intent and mindset of the Equal Act. I think it's important for us to address fentanyl on its own two weak and wicked legs, and that is clearly what it is. It is a killer. And so I'd extend to the gentleman the opportunity to work together on focused legislation or focused opportunity to deal with fentanyl. We have not taken that up yet. We've had some other issues, of course, on our side of the aisle about increased mass incarceration, but we have no opposition for the deadliness of fentanyl. So I would indicate that I have an opposition to its present submission as an amendment, but to the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, and his point, Mr. Chavitz's point about bipartisanship on this legislation, I can say to you that we can work on this matter in our subcommittee, and would be happy to work with the gentleman on that question at this time. With that, I will yield back my time, or yield to the gentleman proponent. If not, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the chairman. I certainly don't want to rain on the bipartisan parade. I'll have a little bit more to talk about in a minute about my concerns and disagreement with the underlying legislation. But with respect to the amendment, I do believe that the amendment has merit. I would recognize that it is, not directly on point with respect to cocaine specifically and the purpose of the underlying bill. However, given the extent to which fentanyl is, in fact, laced into numerous narcotics, notably cocaine, I do believe it's important to make that very clear that nothing would, negatively impact the ability of law enforcement to be able to go after those that are peddling, distributing fentanyl. And right now, we do, in fact, have a crisis of epic proportions relating to fentanyl. And I think it's, what we do as a body matters. What we do in terms of messaging matters. I think saying that whatever the result is of this debate on the crack powder disparity and what that means with respect to punishing those who peddle crack or cocaine, which I'll have more to say about in a minute, we should be very clear that the distribution of fentanyl, which is decimating our young and decimating thousands of Americans, directly as a consequence of wide open borders, which is literally not able to be refuted, right? It's factual, right? Why did Governor DeSantis send resources to Texas? In his speech, he made very clear because of the opioid problem throughout this country. Oh no, we can laugh all day long about open borders and laugh all day long about the impact on Texans right now, today, with fentanyl pouring into Texas. While my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't give a whit, not one whit, about what's happening to Texans today, right now in South Texas, Right now, ranches getting overrun. Right now, human trafficking. Right now, sex trafficking. Right now, a little girl being moved up I-35 because we don't secure the border. And right now, some child in Texas dying because of an overdose of fentanyl. Now, I understand the argument here about the connection to the underlying bill. I get that. But I would note that when we're talking about the extent to which prosecutors have to go about their job in the U.S. Attorney's Office and make decisions about prosecuting, I think it would be great if this body, in the context of talking about how we're prosecuting cocaine offenses, could at least acknowledge the extent to which it is often laced with fentanyl. And we want to be very clear that when people are distributing fentanyl, that we are going to go after them, and that we are going to go after them with the full force of the law, because it is so extraordinarily damaging and dangerous. And again, I'll have more to say in a minute on the actual underlying bill, but I'm not going to be a part of hopping on this pendulum, swinging back away from criminal justice while Joe Biden runs away from his very efforts to make sure that we are responding to the crimes in the 1980s and responding to the scourge of the dangers that was occurring in inner city America and throughout the United States. And now the president, for political purposes, runs away from the very legislation that he put forward in order to try to attack the dangers that was occurring to people throughout our country, while we saw the increases as a resulted from the expansion of crack cocaine in 1986. We all know the history of that, and we've seen the history of that. And now today, we're seeing a history and a moment where fentanyl is pouring into our border through the southwest region of the United States for very obvious reasons, because we will not actually secure the border. And then we are now going to say, oh, we're not going to even talk about it here as we talk about winding back and pulling back from our obligation to ensure that we're enforcing the law against those who peddle these dangerous substances. Without
Gentleman yield.
I would yield
Mr.
to
Roy.
the gentleman from Louisiana.
With his 40 seconds that are left, I'll be brief. I'd echo and identify myself with everything he just said. This is a crisis. And here's the point, to answer Mr. Cohen. If it is, in fact, not related, as you say, I think the benefit of this amendment far outweighs the risk of saying something that may be superfluous. All it says is nothing in this section shall apply to the offense involving fentanyl, which is what you just said is already obvious. Well, why not put it in the language of the bill? There's no risk in doing that. And if there is indeed a nexus between cocaine products and them being laced or mixed with fentanyl, it directly relates. It's certainly germane, and it ought to be a part of the legislation. So I lend my voice of support to it. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment to the amendment nature by Mr. Fitzgerald. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chair, yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
Mr. Cohen votes yes. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
No. No. I'm right here.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Bass.
That's right.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell?
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stemmings? Ms. Stemmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
As a Texan does give a twit, I vote no.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe?
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach? Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts? Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Benz? Mr. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Cohen, you are recorded as aye.
That was a mistake. I should be no.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Isa?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Gates, you are not recorded.
I'd like to vote aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye.
McBath votes no.
Ms. McBath votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 17 ayes and 23 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, you'll be glad that I do not have another amendment, but I do want to acknowledge two guests that are in the room with us temporarily, and in the spirit of bipartisanship and the hard work of Congresswoman Bass, I want to acknowledge Alicia Finley, president of the Botham Jean Foundation. Her brother met an untimely death by law enforcement, and Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, executive director of the Terrence Crutcher Foundation, her brother as well. They are here to add support to the judiciary work that we're doing, both in terms of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which I hope will be bipartisan, continuing, and H.R. 40, because Dr. Crutcher is a resident of Greenwood, Oklahoma, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and of course, we know the Greenwood massacre and the idea of reparations, and she is here supporting H.R. 40 and the work that this committee is doing. And we thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the work that you're doing, and Congressman Bass, and we just wanted to welcome them here from Oklahoma and from Florida, New York. Thank you very much.
The chair extends the welcome on behalf of the committee. The question, for what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity when I first came to the Hill as a staffer in 2003, I worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee and came to know then Senator Jeff Sessions fairly well, along with his staff. And obviously, Senator Sessions went on to become the Attorney General of the United States. Senator Sessions is fairly well known for his efforts and belief as a former United States attorney and prosecutor to take the 100-to-1 ratio and reduce it and introduce legislation along those lines to do it. And I had many conversations with Senator Sessions at the time, asking him why, learning as a young lawyer, and talking to his staff about it, and came to the belief that the 100-to-1 disparity probably was, in fact, out of whack, and that we should make changes to that end. And there were a number of Republicans who worked with Democrats across the aisle to do that. Obviously, we saw a change in I think it was, my history is a little vague here because I wasn't on the Hill at the time, but 2010, 11, 12, when we came into the Obama administration, and then we saw that reduction from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1. I do believe that that is a step in the right direction and a good thing to try to get to the right place. But let's remember why. Let's remember why we embraced these changes in the 80s and the 90s. The levels of crime that we were seeing in our cities were at extraordinary levels. And it was, in fact, the Black community that came to Congress in large numbers, clergy, activists, organizations, asking for Congress to take action because of the highly addictive nature of crack cocaine, the highly negative impact on communities of crack cocaine. And so this was what the genesis of that was. And there was massive bipartisan efforts at the time, massive bipartisan agreement at the time. These are irrefutable facts. That's exactly what occurred. The question then becomes today, what do we do? And as we look today at significant rising crime, significant increases of crime in our communities, when we look today at the website of the Justice Department about gangs, gang violence has risen sharply, especially in large cities. There's a whole section in this section on the Department of Justice website of the nexus and the connection from gang activity to crack cocaine still today. The extent to which this is a massive problem in the communities. I then went back and looked at what Attorney General Sessions was talking about with respect to crime when he took over as Attorney General. This man who had spent a great deal of his life as senator trying to deal with the disparity issue, which we all recognize needed to be dealt with. And when he got to, he talks about this, drug trafficking is an inherently violent business. If you want to collect a drug debt, you can't and don't file a lawsuit in court. You collect it by the barrel of a gun. And for the approximately then 52,000 Americans who died of a drug overdose in 2015, drug trafficking was a deadly business. We are now well past 52,000 drug overdoses in our country as we see the opioid epidemic raging. He wrote then, "My fear is that this surge in violent crime is not a blip, but the start of a dangerous new trend, one that puts at risk the hard-won gains that have made our country a safer place." I would just say to this committee how short our memories are as we now watch what is occurring throughout our country and the significant increase in crime, the significant problems that we see. I do not want to be a part of hamstringing our law enforcement community and the U.S. Attorney's Office and the prosecutors for being able to go after the baddest actors. Never in my time in the Office of the U.S. Attorney did I ever go try to lock up under federal law somebody who was, smoking a joint behind the bleachers at a football game, right? We were going after the worst actors, the ones that the state came to us and said, hey, this guy or this gal is a really bad actor and here's why. And you sit down and you work with law enforcement to do that. And then you look at what you've got and you look at the penalties in front of you, and then you go make a decision to go prosecute the worst offenders. I can talk chapter and verse about federalism. I've supported some of the laws about, let's defer to the states on their moves to make decisions about marijuana, for example. Crack cocaine and powder cocaine, these are lethal, dangerous drugs. And if we want to talk about disparity, I'm happy to talk about bringing down the powder numbers if we want to talk about something to further discuss disparity. But in my view, changing this by just a one-way ratchet of taking the 28 grams and going up, I think that's a problem. I think it'll hamstring our United States attorneys from being able to go after the worst actors in our country. And for that reason, I will ask for a roll call vote, and I will vote no. I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes Ms. Bush seek recognition? For what purposes? For what purposes Ms. Bush seek recognition? You're muted.
Can you hear me? I moved
Now
to
we
strike the
can.
last word.
Now we can.
All right. St. Louis and I thank you, Chairman Nadler. It has been a long-standing commitment for me and our St. Louis community to remedy the anti-Blackness and dehumanization that have informed crack cocaine disparities and allowed our criminal legal system to sentence thousands of people to mandatory minimum prison sentences. Growing up in St. Louis, I saw the crack cocaine epidemic rob my community of so many lives. I lived through a malicious drug war that saw Black people arrested and incarcerated for possession at a much higher rate than our white counterparts. As a nurse, I've watched Black patients be criminalized for crack use while white patients are treated for cocaine use. The vicious drug war that has prioritized punishment over treatment, violence over healing, and trauma over dignity has influenced and affected all of our lives. Our jails were not originally proposed to be treatment centers, and yet our jails have become some of the largest substance use treatment centers in America. People with a history of substance use are being sent to jails that are in no way equipped to treat their trauma or addiction. This is a public health crisis. Too often, drug offenses are born out of poverty. The system allows those with wealth to more easily escape the trauma of police raids, civil asset forfeiture, and mandatory minimums because they can afford top-notch treatment or they have been given a second chance while the rest of the country is left to hurt in silence. Today's consideration of the Equal Act is long overdue. Congress should never have imposed this inequity in the first place. For 35 years, rather than treat drug use, we've criminalized and stigmatized it. Too many times lives have been destroyed. Far too many families have been destabilized. And we talk about building families. And thousands of children have grown up without their parents because our prison systems have taken the place of treatment and wraparound care. That's the devastation caused by the crack cocaine sentencing disparity and ongoing trauma I've seen firsthand. I am compelled to support this legislation because the Equal Act will eliminate the disparity between crack and powder cocaine altogether and make the change retroactive, providing an opportunity for redress to those serving excessively long sentences due to this disparity. Rarely do we have legislation that not only addresses these issues, but is committed to redressing the decades of abuse and the violence this inequity has caused. I applaud my colleagues on this committee for advancing this important legislation that will undoubtedly help save thousands of lives. We must ensure this bill is not just passed, but signed into law, and that we also right the wrongs that this racist sentencing disparity has caused. This bill puts us one step closer to reducing the harms caused by a deeply carceral and punitive approach to public safety. It's long past time for it to end. I move to submit into the record a letter written by the Leadership Conference and the ACLU that discusses the importance of this legislation and how powerful it is that we have a legislation that addresses this issue retroactively.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I am opposed to this legislation and would just tell the gentleman from New York that if he proposed legislation that increased the penalties for powder cocaine 18 times to to eliminate the disparity between these two drugs, I would welcome that. And I wonder sometimes where my colleagues, what world they're living in. At what point in time do we start speaking for the victims of crime on this committee and stop talking about mass incarceration and stop talking about racist implications of these, the laws that are passed? What I saw over and over again were dead bodies from drug overdoses, from murders. My friends that talk about these, jails and prisons being used as drug rehab centers, jails and prisons are used to incarcerate people who commit murder, who commit armed robbery, who commit burglaries and commit a whole slew of violent crimes. And the people that are in there are often drug addicts, and they are driven to commit these violent crimes because of their addiction.
Yes, we should be treating those addictions in prison, but we should be incarcerating people that commit these serious crimes. To pretend that we can somehow wave a wand and do away with violent crime is just crazy. We have to recognize that there is a direct link between the addictive nature of a drug and the other crimes that are being committed. Crack cocaine is different than powder cocaine. It is more addictive than powder cocaine. To treat it the same as powder cocaine is a mistake. It was reduced from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1 because much of the violence in our inner cities was reduced as a result of putting people away. And to suggest that criminals don't understand what the law is a mistake. I prosecuted across the river crack cocaine cases where mules were bringing these drugs up from Florida, and they had exactly 1 gram less than the mandatory minimum amount so that they wouldn't be caught in that particular law. Criminals know the law very well, and it acts as a deterrent. When we do away with laws like this, we do away with the deterrent effect of these laws. We see an increasing amount of violent crime in this country because we are not taking these drugs seriously enough. People talk about the war on drugs has failed. And I don't know that it's failed because we have too few drug rehab programs, which I'm absolutely in favor of. We reduced the crime rate in my judicial district while I was an elected district attorney with drug rehab programs. They're absolutely essential. But to suggest that we don't take the violent crime seriously and we don't recognize the impact on victims of crime from these dangerous drugs, I think is a serious mistake. And I would love to work with my colleagues across the aisle to make sure that we distinguish between those who have committed violent crimes and those who are merely addicted to drugs. But there is a very close correlation between those two.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be glad to yield.
Wouldn't the state laws still be in effect? And so if this guy is so smart that he knows not to bring the 1 gram in, that the state prosecutor in Colorado can still prosecute him?
Sure, and reclaiming my time.
Sure.
The purpose of arresting a mule is to work your way up an organization and be able to get the kingpins, whether they're in Jamaica, whether they're in Mexico, no matter where they are. So there is a purpose for the federal government to be able to go after someone carrying drugs and to make sure that you have a harsh enough penalty that encourages that person to provide information in return for a reduced sentence. So there is a purpose in the federal government engaging in that. But certainly the state government, the state of Illinois has the primary jurisdiction over a murder that is gang and drug related in Chicago, or the same in Los Angeles, the same in New York. The federal government has an obligation, in my opinion. Cocaine isn't grown in the United States. It's typically grown in Colombia and other countries and brought into the United States. And the U.S. government has an obligation under our laws to try to stop that importation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. For what purpose does...
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman, I will strike the last word and yield to the gentleman.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have great respect for the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, but I just wanted to make, 2 observations or 3 observations. One, from the crime-fighting public service, public safety perspective, this change, the Equal Act, does have the support, as Congresswoman Demings indicated, of the major cities chiefs association. I think they're concerned about public safety and crime fighting and has the support of the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. I think they're concerned about public safety and crime fighting. It also has the support of the National District Attorneys Association. I think it's fair to say that they have great concern with public safety and crime fighting, not just retroactively, but the current situation as well as moving forward. And when you go back to the original 1986 law, I think it's widely understood that the notion that 5 grams of crack cocaine would yield effectively the same sentence of 500 grams of powder cocaine, as if there was no quantifiable difference between the two, is just extraordinary. 5 grams of crack cocaine essentially would be the equivalent of these two peanuts, which would yield the same sentence as this is 450 grams, a little bit more than this bottle of powder cocaine, if it were powder cocaine. And so I think one of the reasons why you see people who are Democrats and Republicans, progressives, and conservatives, law enforcement organizations and civil rights organizations coming together is because they recognize that the original legislation was deeply flawed, had no justification under law, and even the revision has no current justification, in part because there's scientific evidence, medical evidence, that there is no pharmacological difference between how the body reacts to crack cocaine and powder cocaine. That was originally believed to be the case in 1986. But crack cocaine is not more highly addictive. That's just a medical reality. Though in 1986, that was the view. I'd also point out in 1986 that there are a lot of folks who believe that the original law, in part, was not simply a reaction to the violent crime that was taking place in many parts of America. Yes, that was the motivation of many, and Charlie Rangel acting in good faith, as has been indicated by members on both sides of the aisle. But there was another intervening event, and that was the death of Len Bias, who was a star basketball player. Many people thought he could rival Michael Jordan. He had just been drafted by the Boston Celtics, and the night after he was drafted, he dies of a drug overdose. And it was a national story. And Congress reacted. That was a horrific death. But Congress reacted a few weeks after Len Bias's untimely passing by comparing this amount of powdered cocaine to this amount of crack. And it was wrong. And Democrats got it wrong. And there were some Republicans who got it wrong. It's a Democratic House, and it was a Republican president. And Democrats and Republicans today are coming together to try to fix that wrong, which was in part inspired not by the evidence of what was happening all across America, but by Len Bias's death. As tragic as that was, we can't make public policy on that basis. And we've seen the consequences decades later of what happens when we do just that. So I'm just thankful for all of my colleagues who have different views, some supportive of the Equal Act, some who perhaps believe that we should maintain what currently exists. And this has been a very positive discussion of people with different views. But I just wanted to make sure that the record reflected that the science is very clear now, and that the motivations, in part, in 1986, weren't simply what was happening across the country, but it was a reaction to a particularly sensationalized event that led to doing something that clearly had adverse consequences for significant communities, not just Black communities, but low-income communities of every race, not just in the inner city, but in rural America and small-town America and in Appalachia as well. And I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, I just want to point out also that there are mandatory minimums for cocaine. The bill before us equalizes the penalty for the two different forms of cocaine, which are medically indistinguishable in its effect, but there are mandatory minimums. Now, maybe we ought to reduce those mandatory minimums, maybe we ought to increase those mandatory minimums, but they're there. And this bill simply recognizes a medical reality that the two forms of cocaine have the same pharmacological effect. I yield back. Does anyone else seek, for our purpose, does the gentleman seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to quickly read in response. I appreciate the gentleman from New York and the law enforcement organizations he cited. I want to read from the National Association of Police Organizations, Inc. Quote, as crack is usually sold in much smaller quantities than powder cocaine, NAPO believes that tinkering with the current sentencing structure will negatively affect the work law enforcement has done to protect our nation's communities from the crime and violence associated with crack cocaine. The reduction of crack cocaine penalties will only accelerate the destruction brought to our neighborhoods by those convicted of federal crack offenses, close quote. With that, I'll yield to my friend from Colorado.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to indicate to the gentleman from New York, the sponsor of this bill, that I have great respect for him and don't question motives at all. And I, in my experience, crack cocaine is more addictive. And I want to just read something. I just looked this up on my phone. Thank God for phones where we can get this information. But I just find it hard to believe that crack is not more addictive. And according to WebMD, an article on WebMD, crack is inhaled through the lung and spreads through the body, producing the high much more quickly and lasts for a shorter time than snorting cocaine, said John Giordano, an addiction counselor and the founder of National Institute for Holistic Addiction Studies. This causes a cycle of binging and crashing, which puts the user at a greater risk of dependence. And there are several other experts who are quoted as saying the same thing. So I respectfully disagree about the addictive qualities of crack cocaine and would suggest that there should be a disparity in the sentencing treatment of that. And I yield back to my friend from Arizona.
Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? In that case, the question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This bill will be followed by immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
Aye.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the
Mr. Chairman.
substitute is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 1693 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. The ayes and nays are requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
And all right, how you guys doing? My name is Steve. Let me get rid of this overlay. There's no White House press conference today. They're doing a press gaggle at 3:45 aboard Air Force One, so I'm not going to cover that. A couple of quick things to talk about. The U.S. government now has announced that the border with Canada is going to remain closed for non-essential travel through August 23rd, I think it was. Which is, hampering every, it's causing delays. But the good thing is we're getting some big drug busts off of the streets because all these border agents that are up on the northern border have a lot of time on their hands because the border is still closed for non-essential travel. So they're spending a lot of time searching trucks and commercial things and commercial vehicles and things. And there's been some huge drug busts in the past year or so along the Canadian border, specifically the 16 border crossing points in New York. There's been a bunch of them there. Let me give an update on what's going on in Staunton, Virginia. Staunton, Virginia, you guys may have seen an article that I put out this morning about the protests that have been taking place there. The protests there, without going into a huge long story, just read the article that's on citizenstringer.com. Just type in Nexus at the top and you'll be able to find all about it. But yesterday, 6 of those paid actors were arrested. Several were charged, according to sources, that they were having some trouble getting a company to bail them out, which is interesting considering all of Nexus's ties to bonding companies and the fact that they don't, allegedly don't pay their bills. So that was kind of interesting. But the article that I wrote this morning was even more interesting because one of our viewers actually was monitoring the live feed that was taken by BLM 757 yesterday. And in that group, that group, that group is from Virginia Beach, so they're not even from this side of Virginia. They're from the other side. This guy has been arrested a ton of times. The one guy, Audrey, or whatever the hell his name is, he's been arrested a ton of times. Someone said that he works security. Well, he hasn't in a while because he's a convicted felon. And from what I understand, you can't work security if you're a convicted felon. But who knows? I mean, it's the liberals run everything now, so you never know. But he was caught on video yesterday, and I don't know if his video's still up or they deleted it. My guess is they'll probably delete it. But he was caught on video yesterday talking about the protests and saying maybe it's time to get the boys to show up, the other guys to show up. And then, they're talking back and forth, and then one of them said the Caucasian guys. So anyone that's watched protests for a long time, you understand, especially if you watch the BLM 757 crowd, you understand that when they're talking about the Caucasian guys with long guns, which is their quote, they're talking about the Boogaloo Boys. Now, if you're just tuning in, here's some real news for you. Boogaloo Boys are not far right. Contrary to what CNN and MSNBC and all these other leftist news organizations say, they are not far right at all. They are far left. They do not hate, or they do not like police. They provide security to BLM protests, and all that could be fact checked, and all that could be double verified and triple verified if you want. It's true. A couple of the Boogaloo Boys were arrested for trying to work with Hamas and become hitmen for Hamas, and they face federal charges for that. A couple of the Boogaloo Boys, one of which was arrested and charged and pled guilty, I believe, to firing an AK-47 at I think it was the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis during the riots, the George Floyd riots. We, on this very show, when we covered the riots last year, there was one of those Boogaloo Boys, or actually two of them, and ironically, one of those people was one that was arrested for trying to become hitmen for the international terror group Hamas. But one of those guys actually said on a video during a protest last year that they were there to kill cops. That's literally what he said during our live broadcast, saying that they were armed and they were there to do it. Now, and again, Boogaloo Boys, white dudes, libertarians, and I've talked to a couple of them in the past, because typically when I start talking about them, they get pissed off and they send me messages and stuff. And a couple of them have actually, had conversations. I had phone conversations with a couple of them, and they're not as fringe as some of these other groups. They do not like law enforcement. They do not like Donald Trump, and they provide, in the past, they have provided security for BLM protests and participated in protests. If you watch the Portland protests that took place last year, guess what? Boogaloo Boys were present. They're the ones that typically are wearing Hawaiian shirts at all these protests. So let me see. There's more that the Boogaloo Boys, Carrillo, he was an Air Force sergeant, I believe. He was, tied to the Boogaloo Boys as well. He's the one that killed Underwood, shot the other federal agent, and then shot a Santa Clara sheriff's officer and killed him before being killed by police. He was a Boogaloo person. Another Boogaloo person was also charged in that for aiding and abetting Carrillo as he was on the lam for killing police. There was a bunch of Boogaloo Boys that were arrested in Las Vegas, armed to the teeth during BLM protests there. There was a bunch of Boogaloo Boys that were arrested in Louisville, Kentucky for shooting at cars while providing security for BLM protests. Again, everyone always wants to say they're far right, which doesn't make any sense. Like all the examples of the crimes that are being committed, the FBI saying that white supremacy is the biggest, domestic terror threat. All the incidents of violence that they use are Boogaloo Boys or Antifa. They're not white supremacists or anything like that. In fact, which is kind of interesting when you actually just, look further than what CNN's headlines read. And it just goes on. There's more and more about that. But so now this little town of Stanton, Virginia, has a real perceived threat. For the most part, the Boogaloo Boys are not a good group of people. They're not. They're fringe. They're far left. They support Antifa. A lot of them say they're anarchists. They don't like big government. They don't like government really at all. They don't like police. They don't like Trump. Oh, I forgot. The most notorious Boogaloo Boy offense, if anyone didn't know, guess what it was? The Gretchen Whitmer, kidnapping plot. Those were all Boogaloo Boys and anarchists. Again, we've covered that extensively, but major news just pretends it's not and said, I saw one article today that said, while they were talking about the fact that the FBI, they used, I think, 16 FBI agents to entrap the 12 Boogaloo Boys that they got for the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. And there's a BuzzFeed article which you could read if you want that goes in a lot of detail about that and the strategies and in the methodology that they use to essentially entrap all these people that had this plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. And it goes on. There's just so many instances of this, but this little town of Stanton, Virginia is going to escalate. If these guys with their Hawaiian shirts and all that shit start marching through the town of Stanton, Virginia, it's going to escalate further. And to be honest, the fault is with the sheriff's department because they're not, until yesterday, they didn't take a hard approach on these protesters because what can you do? It's a First Amendment protected right. But now it seems that last night they arrested 6 of these paid actors. And again, I say actors because they are literally being paid to act in a reality show about protesting. Everyone can fact check it. It's called The System. It's real. It's funded by these people that are part of this immigration scam. And again, nobody cares. Nobody cares. Mainstream media doesn't touch it. We've been reporting on this for a month now. Mainstream media doesn't report on it. Now, one of the cases, and I talked about it briefly last night, but one of the cases yesterday, or that I talked about in the video yesterday, was a case with RLI, which is an insurance company that Nexus Services, which is the company behind all these protests and these free phones that they're giving out for the BLM protests and all this stuff. Well, they actually, an order was just issued yesterday by a judge where Mike Donovan, Richard Moore, and I think it's a vice president of something, whatever, another guy that's an executive, they all have been ordered to appear in person in court on August 10th. So I'm going to go to that one. I'm not going to be able to live stream. Obviously, it's a federal court building, but I'm going to go to that because I want to see. I want them to be arrested for what they're doing to this community. And even though this isn't necessarily, in relation to the community, if they're at least off of the street, then maybe. I'm so tempted to reach out to the RLL attorney and be like, hey, have you seen any of this? This is where your money's going. The money that they owe you, that they're not paying you. This is where it's going, apparently. It's very confusing. So that's what's going on out here in Stanton. As of right now, 6 people were arrested yesterday. They were all released by midnight, I think. But several of them have been trespassed from protesting out in front of the sheriff's department within 100 feet. So yesterday, during this live broadcast by BLM 757, they were making plans on, well, we got to protest across the street. We got to do this. Mike Donovan was there, so you can never say that he's not part of it because he was there on video organizing, and saying, well, some people can't go there, so we may have to go across the street. And I guess some people had to appear in court this morning at 10 o'clock for their arraignments. And so they said, we're just going to go. And then Mike Donovan's like, no, the whole house is leaving at 9:15. It was all recorded. It was all live. I don't know why they would record it all. I guess they're just stupid. But yeah, they did that. So what else? What else? Someone said, Steve, you should be on TV and have your own media platform. I know. But then again, I'm not in control of it. So I don't control what's going on. I can't believe this hearing's still going on. It's been going on for a long time. Anyway, we were watching this crack bill hearing. I forgot what the actual title of it was. I don't really care. Markup of HR 1693, eliminating the quantifiably unjust application of the Law Act. And that's a new bill that's being passed. I guess they're voting on it. They may be doing some other stuff now. But what else? It looks like Apple, our Citizen Stringer app, is going to be in the Apple Store here any minute. Could be now, could be in an hour, could be in 2 hours. We did get the approval. Now we're just waiting for them to publish it. So that's out there. I do have a link that I could send to everybody. I implore you guys, if you don't download the app yet, unless you're a PTNN.TV member. If you're a PTNN.TV member, go and sign up, and then you'll get instructions after on how to download the app and have access to everything. Because otherwise, you just make my job harder because I have to go through each individual sign up, and now we have well over 4,000. So I have to go through each and every individual one, make sure you have a membership to PTNN. Otherwise, I got to downgrade your membership to the app. But it was the easiest way, to be honest. But yeah, the app is awesome, and it's out, and there's different things. So one of the things, I don't have this set up to show you, but one of the things that I wanted to tell people, if you're in the Citizen Stringer app, you'll see there's a couple of videos or a couple of spots where I have a couple of videos, and I'm like, is this working? Is this working? Is this working? And then Adam's got a video that doesn't work because we uploaded it wrong. What was I going to say? Yeah, there's a way if you actually are in the app, and I'm just going to try to show it to you real quick, and then I got to run and end this video because I have to move everything around the office. Again, just, health-wise, I had some blood work done. I got to change some of the stuff that I do around here, including not sitting for so long. I got to switch the way I work out. Instead of trying to lift everything, I just got to be a little bit safer. But if you're in the app and you have it, you'll see up at the top, you see that little right up there, that banner. If you click on that banner, when it comes up, it's the lady that's holding the phone right there, and it says you report the news. If you click on that banner, it opens up where you can record the video. So up at the top here, that's where you choose what show, and Quincy's show is still on there. I got to take it off, but that's where you choose the show that you want to record the video for. Once you do it, it's going to put your address, the geotagged address down here on the bottom. All you have to do is click that, and then you can put wherever you want. If you can put your state, that would be very cool. One of the things we're going to do as soon as it's out on iPad and all that stuff, or iPhones, as soon as that's officially out, then I want everyone to do like a verse of the Star Spangled Banner, or just a couple of words, the national anthem, because what I would like to do is make a video of all of us doing that. Because I think it would be rad to do, and then I'll release that video of Yeater singing it, because I think it would be cool. And then what else? It's blood work, actually. It has nothing to do with weight. It's blood work. Red blood cells are high, and my liver, something to do with the liver. So someone said try fasting to lose fat. I'm not fat. That's the thing. I'm a 307 pound power lifter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change up my diet. I have an addiction to cookies, though. So I'm going to change up my diet, and then even though my cholesterol levels were fine, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going against what the doctors say, and I'm doing it my way, because I feel like it. And I'm going to try to drop back down to like 270, 260. Without losing any strength, because I still want to be able to deadlift a house. You know what I mean? I don't want to lose any weight, and I would still like to make more, Yeah, anyway. Someone said your brother slipped 2 discs on a bench press. No, I thought I had a slight tear in a pec from a bench press a while ago. I slipped discs from deadlifting years ago. It's in the Apple Store, just added it, somebody said there. So that's cool. You guys are officially, whoever downloaded that first, you're the first one who ever downloaded our app in the Apple iStore. Also, guys, if you do download the app, the UI is super awesome. It's super cool. Please do me a favor and leave it a review, okay? Because eventually haters are going to come in here and they're going to leave negative reviews. So if you download it, you like it, works great, please just leave a review on it. That'll help us get more traction and do everything we're trying to do in the long run. Viking Warrior said Pete Santilli show released a video today showing Roseanne Boyland. You wrote Roseanne Boyle, but that's not her name. If you're going to try to say her name, say it properly. Roseanne Boyland being trampled by DC cops. They murdered another patriot, said Viking Warrior on YouTube. I watched that video. I almost wrote an article on it. It's still inconclusive. We know she was trampled. They said she died from a drug overdose, which is completely false based on eyewitness accounts that were there. She had blunt force trauma to her head and was bleeding out of her mouth. But for some reason, they said that. Now, that video is interesting, and I'm not going to link it in here. I may write an article on it later, because what I'm doing now is I'm waiting for someone else that I know was up there to give and saw this to try to get perspective. The video that was released shows police beating people as they were down and indefensive, and that is something that is released in that YouTube video. It shows the Capitol Police brutally, and I will say that, brutally beating protesters who were down. Some were unconscious already, and I got a feeling that's why the video never made any airtime. That's why we hadn't seen it. So I'm trying to do more investigations to find out. There's a couple of things that are wrong with that video because it says that Roseanne Boyland was wearing a tan jacket, except she wasn't. That wasn't her that was down. That was another woman that happened to be down and was in the process of being trampled. There was a lot of weird things, but that video does open up the show of, or I guess it opens up the perspective to understand that everything that we've said happened at the Capitol. I mean, I have a screenshot I could put up, on my Twitter that one of the viewers captured of that cop punching that old man. Because I knew we captured it live. I just couldn't find it in the video because I'm not going to watch through 7 hours. One of the viewers did and actually captured the moment that cop was, cocked back, getting ready to punch the old man, and the moment he punched him, and then the crowd started moving in. I mean, it's clear as day. That was one of the major pushes on the Capitol, and it was started by a Capitol police officer. And, here at this network, we call out bad cops. That cop is a bad cop, and he still is yet to be identified from what I understand. He's a bad cop that shouldn't be on the job. Someone said you need to encourage Villain to post a video, Steve. Yeah. There's a lot of other people there, too. But yeah, that's about it. The hearing is still live. I suppose we can listen to it for a little bit. I'm losing interest in listening to this crack hearing. I don't know if that's still what they're talking about or they're talking about something else, but they're still in session. I'll put it, leave a review in the Apple Store and on the other store. And Villain doesn't have this particular video. I called him too this morning, and he doesn't have it. But please leave reviews. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to switch back to the hearing in a second, but if you're watching on YouTube, please do me a favor. Even if you support us in other platforms, become a member there. It's like $1.99 or $2.99 a month. What we're trying to do is if we get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, 1,000 subscribers on Facebook, we're going to hire a producer to work on the back end of all of our shows, a full-time employee, because that'll allow us to spend less time actually getting the show ready and more time figuring out what the hell we're going to talk about. Because sometimes it's so hard and we ramble on. But unless you do this for a living, you don't understand how much stuff goes into the back end. But I don't know how long this is going to go. My wife is bringing lunch, and when she brings lunch back, I'm probably just going to end the video if there's nothing good going on. And then, because again, I'm going to be live at 8 o'clock tonight for the show Wake Up America. That'll be live. Have no idea what I'm going to talk about. It could be the fact that an active DEA agent was just charged with the January 6th riots, and he was apparently helping out his buddy who was an FBI agent who was conducting surveillance, even though he said he was there in an unofficial capacity, even though he's an FBI agent that was there on the ground at the Capitol. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about what's transpired out with the Gretchen Whitmer. I don't even know what you call it. I don't even want to call it a kidnapping plot anymore. The FBI kidnapping plot, the plot by the FBI to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, that's what it should be. But whatever. And if you're watching FBI, you're more than welcome. If you want to be a whistleblower on any of these big stories, send me an email. Keep you completely anonymous, but I want to know what's really going on and why the FBI agents seem to be everywhere without being anywhere. You know what I mean? You can't stop the massive amounts of gun crime that are happening in cities across the United States, but turns out you're at the Capitol. Turns out you were investigating some bozo, church group out of Northern Virginia for months and months. Turns out you guys surveilled a guy for walking through the Capitol and taking pictures for 3 months, spending all that resources trying to tie him to something bigger, and you failed because there was nothing bigger. He just happened to be a guy that was walking through the Capitol. It seems like there's a lot of resources being misspent. And I would love to have some insight from someone that's actually there doing the job on what it is. Because every day I get emails from other, conspiracy theorists, even though I don't want to say that, but people that are like, oh, this is why they're doing it, without any direct knowledge of why they're actually doing it. So I would love to have people that actually want to come up and talk about what's really going on. And I know they watch this show because, well, I know you watch the show. So if any of you guys want to come on, or, anonymously, if you want to call, you guys can find my phone number. You probably already have it anyway. Call and let me know what the heck is going on in this country. Why is the FBI seemingly working hard to set up people that and create these plots that they didn't even have plans for? Anyway, whatever. Let's go back to this hearing. I'm only going to keep it up for a little bit, and then I'm going to switch it off and end it, and then I'll be live at 8 o'clock tonight. Eastern time is when my show is, but yeah, we'll see in a little bit.
Yeah, the amendment eliminates that preference consideration. Instead, the Attorney General's report will include an analysis of referral practices including consideration of demographic information. This is a modest but important change, and I urge all members to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Ms. McBath seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I really want to thank our colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee, for bringing forth this really important piece of legislation, as I myself work a great deal with the veterans community in my district. And I know that one of the privileges that I've had in Congress is to work to improve the lives of those that have really given so much to our country and to our nation, and that is our veterans. And I come from a family of many veterans, and I'm proud to have a veteran actually working in my district office to help serve our veterans in our community. We all know that our veterans sometimes pay a great cost in terms of their physical health in service to our country, but many also suffer from depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other mental health conditions, and some also face the burdens of addiction. Veteran treatment courts play an important role in helping our veterans who have mental health or drug problems when they get involved with our criminal justice system. And often these people who need just simply treatment, counseling, and mentorship, not a prison sentence. While every program is different, they are all designed to provide structure, accountability, and a path forward for those who are willing to get the treatment that they need or to do the hard work of facing their own addictions. And I've been proud to support our veteran treatment courts in my community, and this bill will make sure that more veterans get the help that they need to get back on track again and to again become the pillars of our communities that they really so often are. And I am pleased that this bill has provisions that will improve data collection. With this data, we can better develop the best practices for veteran treatment courts and do even more to reduce recidivism. We'll also be able to see whether or not these courts are serving the needs of all our veterans, including women and most specifically veterans of color. Our brave men and women, they sacrifice so very much to protect our democratic ideals. And when they end their service, we must see to it that we take care of them, whether their needs are physical, mental, or behavioral. And the Real Justice for Our Veterans Act is a part of that effort. And I thank Congresswoman once again, Sheila Jackson-Lee, and the chair of the Crime Subcommittee for introducing this legislation. I'm pleased to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Ross seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This bill, led by our colleague, Congresswoman Jackson-Lee, marks a critical step in ensuring that our veterans are properly cared for within our criminal justice system. Veterans suffer disproportionate rates of substance abuse and are often related to mental illness. Such mental health disorders, if untreated, can lead many veterans to become involved in the criminal justice system. My dad was a psychiatrist in the Air Force during the Vietnam era and saw the effects that war can have on our service members. Treatment courts provide a key resource for veterans because their judges have demonstrated experience in handling veterans' cases and understand factors that lead to veteran involvement in the criminal justice system. These courts possess institutional knowledge of veteran-targeted resources that can be offered in lieu of incarceration. As a representative of a state and a district with a large veteran population, I care deeply about ensuring that gender or race does not dictate access to veteran treatment courts. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation as a promising path forward to care for our veterans who have sacrificed so much for our country. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to thank Chairman Jackson Lee for her leadership in introducing this important bill. As several of our colleagues have mentioned, too often our veterans suffer wounds of war that make them more vulnerable to substance abuse, disorder, and mental health challenges that can lead them into the criminal justice system. I want to share a few words from a veteran who now serves in Philadelphia's Veterans Treatment Court. After returning to Philadelphia from Iraq in 2003, it took me only 4 days to see the inside of a jail cell. I was arrested for aggravated assault. My drinking and eventually drugging had given me all of what I thought I needed to transition back into society. I was wrong. It was exactly what I didn't need. I put a Band-Aid on my emotions by using substances to get through each day. Those substances destroyed my life. I had 7 arrests and spent a year in prison. I lost my family, and what hurt the most was not being with my daughter for the first 4 years of her young life. Something had to change if I was going to survive. After my final arrest, I was put into the Philadelphia Veterans Court. There is no question it saved my life. I found other veterans who were all working on the same mission, the mission of recovery. Help is what we get in veterans treatment courts. My life began to change. After graduation from Veterans Court, I decided to stick around and continue to be a volunteer for the new veterans coming into court each week. My mission about recovery isn't just about me, it's the younger version of me who was about to see the inside of a jail cell for the first time. What veterans courts do is make sure that veterans don't see the inside of those jail cells more than once. For veterans who rely on the veteran treatment courts for substance abuse and mental health treatment services, it's critical that we ensure that those programs are using evidence-based treatments. This bill will accomplish that while also guaranteeing that the quality and access to care is equal for racial and ethnic minorities and women. I'm also glad to see the language includes a pilot program that aims to improve retention rates in veteran court treatment programs and encourage programs to improve their completion rates. Veterans who've sacrificed their physical and mental safety for our country should have the highest level of care upon their return. This includes access to substance abuse and mental health resources, as this bill ensures, and also legal aid to ensure that they can take advantage of the programs they're entitled to. That's why I've introduced the bipartisan Veterans Medical Legal Partnership Act, which would provide grants to state and local governments to create medical legal partnerships aimed at ensuring access to legal services for veterans, ultimately reducing homelessness and recidivism and preventing victimization among former service members. I look forward to working with my colleagues to move that bipartisan piece of legislation and other veteran-focused legislation through our committee. And I encourage my colleagues to support the Real Justice for Our Veterans Act, which would make meaningful change for our veterans. Thank you again, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, for your leadership and in focus on this important issue. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Correa seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Is recognized.
And I also want to stand to thank my colleague, Ms. Jackson Lee, for this important legislation. In my home county, Orange County, California, we also have a drug court, treatment court, homeless court, veterans court. And I've seen the difference that these courts can make in a person's life. Instead of having a confrontational criminal court environment, a prosecutor, defense attorney, probation officer, social service workers, all teaming up to make sure that veterans receive the services they need to get back on their feet. This bill is a tremendous step forward, but it's not enough. We also have veterans that have fought for our nation, served with honor, and have it discharged honorably. And these vets, legal immigrants with green cards, get into trouble because of things like PTSD and then have their green card and residency removed, pulled, and are then deported. These veterans, under current law, cannot return to the United States. However, once they die in foreign soil, they can have their bodies returned to the United States and buried in a national cemetery. What a terrible travesty of justice. As has been said many times here today, our veterans deserve better. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? The question occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Okay. This will be followed immediately by a vote on final passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Opposed,
Aye.
no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in nature of a substitute is agreed to. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 4035 is amended favorably to the House. Those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it.
Yeah, shut up. Hey, I said I was done, but I'm not done. There's a new video, another hearing that we should have been watching. Apparently it was pretty good, and I didn't watch it because I was busy doing other stuff. So Senator Ted Cruz just went berserkazoid on who is this? Well said, Senator Ted Cruz. Where was this hearing? I don't remember where it was. It was a hearing, I think, on the oh gosh. Let me see if I can't find it again. I just lost it. So, Agricultural Secretary Tom Visilak. So this just took place, and apparently Visilak was talking about the border crisis. So Ted Cruz had this to say. Stay tuned.
Your answers on immigration were fertilizer. They were nonsense. Your answer, you said, why are we seeing this crisis? Your answer was poverty. There are 7 billion people on planet Earth, many of whom were poor. And you know what? They were poor last year. And we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. They're poor this year. What's changed is this administration refuses to enforce the law, and Texas is paying the price for it. That's what's changed. Your other answer was the pandemic. Mr. Secretary, last year there was a pandemic, and we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Poverty didn't magically appear on January of 2021, and the pandemic didn't appear on January 2021. What appeared was Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and policies that are inhumane, that are cruel, and that are failing.
Senator, was the border secure last year?
Last year, it was the most secure it's been in 45 years.
If that's the case, why didn't you all pass the Ag Modernization Act last year after it passed the House? You're telling me that it's got to secure the border before you pass
Let
this
me be
act.
clear. I'm not Lindsey Graham. I don't support this bill.
well,
No. Look. I understand that there have been Democrats and Republicans who support amnesty. I ain't one of them.
Why
I get that you want amnesty. I get that your invitation is come to America, forget the legal processes, and everyone.
I want a workforce that's going to continue to support the greatest agriculture and food industry in the world. That's what I'd like to have. Senator.
Well, I'll tell you. I thought you wanted him to respond.
Senator, you've taken more time than any other senator this morning. Will you please wrap up?
This is a crisis. This administration caused it, and this committee doesn't even care to have a hearing on the suffering that is happening at the border that is caused by policies that don't work.
Damn! Here's another one. So this was the beginning of it. So I played the wrong video, but whatever. Listen.
Instead, we have a hearing with the Secretary of Agriculture. Mr. Secretary, if we were having a hearing on the optimum fertilizer for growing corn, I think you might be a very good witness. Does the Department of Agriculture secure the border?
We're not responsible for the law enforcement aspect of this, but
no. Hold on.
Well, you ask a question.
Allow the witness to answer.
Okay, my question was, do you secure the border? The answer is no.
No.
Do you run the cages?
No.
Do you prosecute the traffickers?
No.
Are you the Attorney General?
No, sir.
Are you the Secretary of Homeland Security?
No, sir.
And with all due respect, your answers on immigration were fertilizer. They were nonsense. Your answer, you said, why are we seeing this crisis? Your answer was poverty.
Finally, someone cares about real news and real content and doesn't want to waste hours and hours and hours arguing some trivial BS in a hearing that has nothing to do with what they should be talking about. Man, Ted Cruz is a hero. I don't care who you are. All right, let's go back to this stupid hearing.
The long-term success of re-entering individuals. This bill offers greater opportunities for success for individuals returning from prison as well as their communities. I thank Representative Bass, Representative Reschenthaler, and their bipartisan co-sponsors for introducing this important legislation again, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the bill. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Successful reentry into society helps reduce recidivism, improve public safety, and save taxpayer dollars. We have seen successful criminal justice reform programs, including reentry programs, work in Republican-led states like Texas. This is a worthwhile goal and something that President Trump and his administration prioritize. H.R. 3372 would build on President Trump's strong record of criminal justice reforms, and I'm pleased that my Democrat colleagues are following his lead. In 2018, he signed the First Step Act into law. The First Step Act reauthorized the Second Chance Act, a 2007 law aimed at reducing recidivism and improving outcomes for people returning from incarceration. H.R. 3372 applies a holistic approach to reentry to achieve results that are more favorable to the offender and to our communities. While this goal is important, I do think it's important we understand the bill authorizes programs duplicative of existing federal grant programs already authorized by the Second Chance Act. In other words, grants that would be created by H.R. 3372 can be funded currently with currently authorized and appropriated programs. Overall, I think this is a good piece of legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank the author of this legislation as well. I rise in strong support of H.R. 3372, the One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program, and applaud our colleague, Representative Karen Bass, for authoring this bill and for her work on important reentry issues. This bill is a compassionate, common sense measure. It makes sense for the individual leaving incarceration and the community that they are returning to. All but 5% of people who are incarcerated are eventually released. That means 95% of those currently incarcerated will have to make the difficult journey to reenter and make a new life for themselves. Starting life anew is difficult enough. We know it. We know these people. They are our neighbors in our community. The journey is even more difficult for a previously incarcerated individual. Many previously incarcerated individuals will return to their neighborhoods that they barely recognize without jobs or a place to live. Many will not have basic job skills to compete in the modern economy, and only the lucky few will have family members or friends there to assist them through this difficult transition. H.R. 3372 would provide the critical link between the reentering individual and the resources they need to succeed to come out of incarceration. The single point of information makes referrals and carrying out reentry plans substantially easier and therefore more likely to succeed. The concept that this bill promotes from release to self-sufficiency is critical to successful reentry efforts. Many of us have visited shelters or veterans facilities, and we see the veterans there, many of them young, who are also individuals who have come out of prison. They need help. To connect these individuals to the resources they need, the bill would authorize a 24/7 reentry hotline to connect these recently released with reentry services near their home. The reentry hotline would maintain a list of reentry services throughout the United States for individuals who are released into smaller or new communities. The public safety benefits of this legislation are clear. Reentry success produces cost savings and community benefit. This bill provides citizens leaving prison with the necessary tools and resources to be economically self-sufficient. It gives reentering individuals a stronger chance. That's why I am such an enthusiastic supporter of this bill. I again thank the chairman for taking up this legislation and applaud Representative Bass for authoring this important bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And now the gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I support reentry programs. They do help in the reduction of recidivism, and that in turn helps improve our public safety. However, I am opposed to the federal government bribing the states to implement policies. We see this all too often in this committee. And as one who is a strong believer in federalism, this continues to undermine my goals of restoration of federalism and actually the separation of powers, as James Madison described it, both horizontally and vertically. So many of the bills we see before this committee are just bribes to the states to implement a particular policy. The grants created by this bill are also duplicative of existing grants authorized by the Second Chance Act. If state and local governments need additional funding, they should provide that funding, especially with the dollars that have been sent their way from the federal government over the past year. It is not the responsibility of the federal government to provide grants to states and local governments to cover their expenses. Instead of creating new grant programs, members should work with their state legislatures, city councils, or other local government bodies to address these issues. We need to get serious and recognize the financial crisis facing our nation as well. We need to find a way to address these issues without increasing spending. I will be opposing the bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I'm pleased to recognize the author of the legislation, Congresswoman Bass.
Thank you. I'm going to strike the last word. I want to thank the chairman for once again bringing this bill up for consideration the second time in the past two Congresses we considered it. The One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act, which I've introduced along with my colleague, Representative Guy Reschenthaler and Representative Owens, will fill a critical void in reentry services by providing resources for state and local jurisdiction to make grants to establish a more centralized process for assisting individuals who are reentering their communities after a period of incarceration. Madam Chairman, during the debate over the Equal Act, we discussed how the sentencing laws for cocaine led to a disruption of families and neighborhoods. We all know the statistics. More people are incarcerated in the United States than anywhere in the world. During the war on drugs, during the Get Tough on Crime period, we actually abandoned rehabilitation and just focused on punishment. We passed hundreds of laws that banned people who were incarcerated from participating in the legal economy, from working, from living in certain areas. Arrests then were concentrated in certain zip codes, and individuals are then returned to these zip codes. When our laws effectively block people from working or fully participating, unfortunately, they will survive by any means necessary, so it's no surprise that without options, many return to crime. In California, the recidivism rate has been close to 70%. People cycle in and out, destabilizing families and disrupting neighborhoods. This bill will assist in reducing crime in areas that are disproportionately impacted by assisting individuals reintegrate to the legal economy, find housing, access to health care. Last year, when the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security held a hearing entitled Returning Citizens, Challenges and Opportunities for Reentry, at that hearing, we heard about the challenges that many individuals face. So imagine you're incarcerated for many years. During the time period of your incarceration, you were diagnosed with diabetes, placed on insulin, or you were diagnosed with schizophrenia, placed on antipsychotic medication, and then you are released back into the community with no access to health care. Your medicines are cut off. You don't have an ID. You can't get a driver's license because you owe back child support. You don't have a place to live. You can't associate with people who've been formerly incarcerated, even though there might be members of your family that were formerly incarcerated or certainly in your neighborhood. So these challenges can oftentimes be insurmountable, and we must figure out how to address them because access to support services is so critical to successful reentry. And if you don't care about the individuals, that's unfortunate. But understand that when people are arrested and incarcerated in concentrated zip codes and you return them to those neighborhoods and block them from any way to be reintegrated into the legal economy, you actually contribute to crime in those areas because you leave people without options. The one-stop shop model that this legislation supports would provide a full panoply of reentry services all at a single location, calibrated to address the critical elements of the reentry process. Critical services such as housing and job training, navigating access to health care would be available at the one-stop centers. And hopefully these centers will be led and staffed by people who were formerly incarcerated. In addition to one-stop centers, this bill authorizes the Attorney General to establish a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week reentry service assistance hotline to direct recently released individuals to appropriate reentry services in their locations. When Congress passed the Hallmark Second Chance Act that the ranking member talked about, We demonstrated our commitment to provide housing, employment, assistance, substance abuse treatment, and other related services to returning individuals with the goal of reducing recidivism. This one-stop shop bill would go a step further by ensuring that returning citizens can actually access these services. One of the things that we have done with reentry resources, both on a federal level and on a state level, is we've given those resources over to probation. People still have difficulty accessing the services that are supposed to be available in the Second Chance Act. And so without critical reentry services, without programs that are led and staffed by people who were formerly incarcerated, who can do the hand-holding that is frankly inappropriate for law enforcement or probation to do, people will continue to fall through the cracks and won't be able to access the services that are provided in legislation that we pass, such as the Second Chance Act. So we must help to facilitate this access, which will also help to ensure a reduction in recidivism, help to keep our communities safe, and reduce crime. So I want to thank the chairman, I want to thank the co-sponsors for this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this measure today. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
All right, real quick, just in case anyone that isn't following on what's going on here in the country, there's a live police chase currently taking place in Southern California, except the helicopter is so far away because they are running out of fuel and they have to go get it. This police chase has been going on for about, 14 minutes or so, maybe 25 minutes, who cares? And this guy's driving erratically. He's apparently wanted for a occupied burglary. He's been driving speeds upwards of 150 miles an hour. There was rumors that he was going to be out of gas, and then it turns out that was... But that feed has gone out, so I'm going to keep trying to find it, and because that's going to be more entertaining than this darn hearing while I'm waiting for my lunch. But because, we have to wait, I will... put the hearing back on.
Reentering citizens, legal assistance, and opportunities for mentorship as part of reentry services. For years, I had the opportunity to work with a reentry program started by judges in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania with the goal of reducing recidivism, the STAR program. It became a model for federal courts, recruiting volunteer attorneys to represent returning citizens to address the myriad legal issues that impeded their success in reentry, whether it was getting a driver's license reinstated so that a person could get a job, or helping them secure housing or medical insurance. All of these things were providing blocks to people being able to successfully reenter. In addition, this program provides an opportunity for mentoring. And as chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Youth Mentoring Caucus, I know how valuable mentorship can be in helping individuals navigate the challenges of returning home after incarceration. Mentoring is an evidence-based initiative that leads to positive outcomes in areas like employment and educational attainment. And it's important that returning individuals have access to this support. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting forth this critical legislation for our consideration today. And thank you to Representative Bass for introducing this important bipartisan bill. I look forward to voting to pass the One-Stop Shop Community Reentry Program Act out of committee today, and urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes? Mr. Tiffany, seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. Gentlelady reserves a
point of order.
Amendment to H.R. 3372, offered by Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin. Page 15.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I share this important amendment with you today, and in a nutshell, what it is a maintenance of effort provision to make sure that we're protecting funding for our law enforcement. I mean, we were hearing across the country the clarion call of defund the police, and some people in some cities are following through with that, and we're seeing the results of higher crime. So I'm asking for your support today for this amendment to the One Stop Community Reentry Center grant program. Today, we are seeing bills that aim to lessen the penalties for those who willingly choose to break our laws, victimize families, and harm our communities. Crime rates are soaring across America. It's important that we support those who enforce the laws of this nation, those men and women who sacrifice each day to make our communities safer, from those who are beneficiaries of reduced criminal penalties and no cash bail systems. My amendment does that and prohibits grant money from being awarded to states who arbitrarily and capriciously defund their police departments to appease the loud minority. If we are proposing giving grants to reintegrate convicted criminals into society, we must also never forget the hard work and sacrifices made by those who investigate the crimes, protect the victims of crimes, prevent crimes, and bring those same criminals to justice. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment, to show solidarity and support for our law enforcement. And
all right, tell you what I'm going to do, because I'm overhearing this hearing. You guys can watch it if you go to, oh gosh, where is it? I don't even know which hearing it is. Is it this one? No, that was a different one. I don't even know where the hearing is. We're not going to learn anything. It's a bunch of useless bills that are being passed that aren't going to do anything to actually solve any of the problems that we have currently facing our country right now, but who cares? As you see the caption down below, there was a live police chase in Los Angeles, except the helicopter that was following it had to depart to go get fuel because apparently they weren't prepared for a long police chase. That police chase resulted, or what is the result from a occupied burglary. The guy was driving too. It looked like he was in maybe a Charger or one of those Magnums, I think maybe. Is that what they're called? But he was flying. 150 mile an hour speeds. Police were not anywhere near him at all. Just the Chiapas. And all the feeds that had that as well seemed to be down. My wife just got here with a sandwich. Look at that timing, man. But yeah, I'm going to wrap it up, and then I got a bunch of stuff to do, and I got to also hit the gym today. But I'll be live at 8 o'clock. We're going to talk about the January 6th riots and why police were there. And were they rioting? Or what were they doing? I don't know. But there's a page on YouTube, or I'm sorry, it's on Facebook, which you can hear there, but they don't have any live feeds either. So, yeah, whatever. See you guys at 8 o'clock tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll see you then. Bye.